The water was rising faster than anyone had predicted, swallowing the artillery positions first, then the ammunition depot, and now it was licking at the makeshift hospital tents where 47 wounded men lay strapped to canvas cots. Sergeant Kozlov watched the brown surge creep across the valley floor and knew that in less than 3 hours, every man, every gun, every last chance of holding this position would be underwater. The German advance had stalled not because of Soviet resistance, but because of the river, the same river now threatening to drown them all. And standing in knee-deep mud beside a rusted collection of pipes and gears that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard, not on a battlefield, was Pavel Volkov, a farmer from Voronezh who kept saying the same 3 words over and over: "I can fix this." Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this story has already pulled you into the battlefield, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss any forgotten acts of courage or impossible inventions, subscribe and join our front line of history. The mission's just getting started. Now, back to the scene. The rain hadn't stopped for 6 days. What had begun as a tactical advantage, the autumn storms that turned the roads into impassable soup, stalling the German mechanized advance toward Moscow, had become a trap. The Volkhov River, swollen beyond its banks, had transformed the entire eastern approach into a vast, shallow lake. Command had ordered Colonel Petrov's battalion to hold the Krasny Bridge at all costs, the last intact crossing for 40 kilometers. They had held it, they had bled for it, and now the river was going to take it anyway. Pavel Volkov had arrived with the civilian conscripts 3 weeks earlier, part of the mass mobilization that swept up every man between 16 and 60 who could hold a shovel. He was 42, built like a water tower, with hands that could palm a man's skull and shoulders that had spent 2 decades hauling irrigation equipment across the black earth farms of central Russia. He spoke rarely, listened constantly, and had a peculiar habit of staring at machinery the way other men stared at women, with complete, devoted attention. Sergeant Kozlov had noticed him on the 2nd day, when a supply truck's axle had snapped under the weight of ammunition crates. While the motor pool mechanics argued about requisition forms and replacement parts, Pavel had simply walked over with a length of pipe, a hammer, and a coil of wire. 20 minutes later, the truck was moving again. The repair wouldn't last a week, but it didn't need to. Nothing needed to last a week anymore. "Volkov," Kozlov had said, making a note on his clipboard, "you're reassigned. Report to engineering." "There is no engineering unit, Sergeant." "There is now. You're it." That had been 3 weeks ago. Now, as water crept past their ankles and the rain continued its relentless percussion on their helmets, Kozlov realized that the farmer with the strange eyes and the stranger obsession with broken machinery might be the only thing standing between them and annihilation. The contraption Pavel had built looked like madness given form. A central axle salvaged from a destroyed T-34 tank, connected to a series of interlocking gears stripped from a harvester that had been abandoned in the retreat. Attached to this mechanical heart were 6 enormous screw pumps, Archimedean screws, Pavel called them, though Kozlov had no idea what that meant. Each one fashioned from sheet metal panels, wooden slats, and what appeared to be parts of an old windmill. The whole assembly sat on a platform of logs lashed together with steel cable, and it was supposed to be driven by a diesel engine from a half-destroyed generator truck. "It will never work," said Lieutenant Sokolov, the battalion's quartermaster, a thin man with accountant's eyes who saw every resource as a number in a ledger. "You've wasted 3 days on this fantasy while we should have been preparing a retreat." Pavel didn't look up from the gear assembly he was adjusting with a wrench the size of a man's forearm. "The pumps will move 8,000 liters per minute. All 6 together, maybe 50,000. That's 3 million liters per hour. The river is bringing in 10 times that amount. Sokolov snapped. "Your arithmetic is as broken as your machine." "I don't need to stop the river," Pavel said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I just need to move the water away from the bridge and the hospital. Create a channel. Let it flow around us instead of through us." Kozlov stepped closer, studying the apparatus. "Can you make it work?" Pavel set down the wrench and met his eyes. In that moment, Kozlov saw something he hadn't expected. Not hope, not confidence, but something harder and more practical. Certainty born from experience. This was a man who had spent his life solving impossible problems with insufficient resources. A man who had watched crops fail and seasons turn hostile, and had survived by making broken things work just enough. "I can make it work," Pavel said, "but I need 2 things. Name them." 20 men to help me dig the channel, 400 meters, from here to the old stream bed east of the tree line, and 12 hours. Sokolov laughed, a sharp bark without humor. 12 hours? The water will be over the bridge in 3. This position will be untenable in 4. Then I need to start now. Kozlov looked at the rising water, at the hospital tents where men were already being moved to higher ground that didn't exist, at the artillery pieces half submerged and useless. He looked at the bridge, the strategic prize they'd paid for in blood, now about to become worthless, not because of enemy action, but because of nature's indifference. He made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed in any rational army. "You have your 20 men," Kozlov said, "and you have until dawn. After that, we evacuate what we can carry and blow the bridge." Pavel nodded once, picked up his wrench, and went back to work. The rain fell harder. The men Kozlov assigned to Pavel were the walking wounded, the support staff, the ones who couldn't fire a rifle but could still hold a shovel. They gathered in the mud at the base of Pavel's mad machine, staring at it with expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. "This is going to save us?" asked Dmitri, a radio operator with a bandaged hand and the skeptical eyes of a man who had seen too many plans fail. "This is going to move water," Pavel corrected. "Saving you is something you'll have to do yourselves." He divided them into 3 crews. The first would dig the channel, cutting a trench through the saturated earth toward the old stream bed that ran parallel to the river, abandoned since the spring floods had carved a new course. The second crew would work on finishing the pump assembly, welding the screw housings and sealing every joint with whatever they could find: tar, rubber gaskets stripped from trucks, even melted candle wax when nothing else would work. The third crew, the smallest, would work with Pavel himself on the engine coupling, the critical junction where the diesel motor's power would be transferred to the gear train. It was engineering by desperation, construction by collective faith in a man they barely knew. By midnight, they had made progress that seemed impossible. The channel was half cut, a muddy scar through the earth that leaked water as fast as they could dig it. The pump screws were mounted, 6 enormous spirals that gleamed dully in the light of oil lamps, each one angled at precisely 15 degrees to maximize lift efficiency. Pavel had explained this to no one, simply adjusted each mounting bracket with the focused intensity of a jeweler setting a diamond. The engine was another matter. "The coupling shaft is warped," Pavel announced, his voice flat. He was lying half-submerged in muddy water beneath the platform, examining the connection point between the diesel engine and the main axle by the light of a handheld torch. Someone overheated this engine before it was abandoned. The heat stress bent the output shaft by maybe 3 degrees. 3 degrees doesn't sound like much, Dmitri said, hopefully. 3 degrees at this torque means the whole system will vibrate itself apart in under 10 minutes. Pavel slid out from under the machine, water streaming from his uniform. His face was expressionless, but Kozlov saw something flicker in his eyes. the first crack in that unshakable certainty. "Can you fix it?" Kozlov asked. Pavel didn't answer immediately. He stood there in the rain, looking at the machine, at the pumps, at the half-dug channel, calculating. "I need to true the shaft, straighten it. How? Heat and force. Controlled heating to make the steel pliable, then mechanical correction using a press. We don't have a press. Then I'll build one." Sokolov, who had been watching from a distance with his arms crossed, finally approached. "This is insanity. We're wasting time and resources on a machine that won't work, based on the word of a farmer who thinks he's an engineer." Pavel turned to face him, and for the first time there was emotion in his voice. Not anger, but something colder. "I am not an engineer. Engineers draw plans and calculate stresses and build things that last forever. I build things that work right now, with whatever I can find, with bare hands. Because the crops don't wait, and the seasons don't care about your plans. You want perfect, wait for the war to end. You want functional, get out of my way." The two men stared at each other in the rain. The fundamental divide between theory and practice made flesh. Kozlov stepped between them. "Build your press, Volkov. You have 4 hours until dawn." What Pavel built couldn't properly be called a press. It was leverage incarnate. A wooden beam 20 feet long, braced against the platform, and weighted at one end with a suspended steel plate from the destroyed tank. By heating a section of the warped shaft with a torch made from a fuel can, and positioning it under the lever, Pavel could apply tons of force to specific points along the metal. It was blacksmith's work, medieval and brutal, performed by torchlight in a rainstorm while water rose around their knees. Dmitri held the torch. 2 others worked the pulleys that raised and lowered the weight. Pavel watched the metal, his eyes never leaving the faint glow of heated steel, calling out adjustments in millimeters. Heat, press, cool, measure, again and again. At 3 in the morning, with the water at mid-thigh and the hospital tents being dismantled, Pavel slid the coupling collar onto the shaft. It fit, not perfectly. Nothing about this machine was perfect, but it fit well enough that the collar locked into place without binding. "Start the engine," Pavel said. Kozlov pulled the starter cord on the diesel engine. It coughed, sputtered, died. He pulled again. This time it caught, settling into a rough idle that sent vibrations through the entire platform. Pavel engaged the gear train. The sound that emerged was indescribable, a mechanical howl that combined grinding gears, creaking wood, and the deep bass rumble of the screws beginning to turn. The whole platform shuddered, threatening to shake itself apart. Water splashed as the lower sections of the screws bit into the flood. And then, incredibly, water began to move. The Archimedean screws, turning in their housings, began to lift water from the flooded ground and push it toward the half-finished channel. It wasn't much at first, a trickle, then a stream, then a steady flow that grew as the engine reached full speed, and all 6 pumps synchronized into a rhythm that sounded almost organic, like the breathing of some vast mechanical beast. The men stopped digging to stare. Water was flowing uphill. "God in heaven," Dmitri whispered. "No," Pavel said, adjusting a throttle valve. "Just Archimedes and desperation." By dawn, the water level around the bridge and hospital had dropped by half a meter. The channel was complete, a crude ditch that nonetheless guided the pumped water away from their defensive positions and back toward the river's new course. The machine howled and shook and leaked oil from a dozen joints, but it held together. It worked. Sergeant Kozlov stood on the bridge, watching the sun rise through breaking clouds, and allowed himself the first full breath he'd taken in 6 days. "Volkov," he called out. Pavel looked up from where he was adjusting a bearing that had begun to smoke. "You did it." "We did it," Pavel corrected. "But this isn't finished." "What do you mean?" Pavel gestured at the machine, at the engine that was already showing signs of strain. "This will run for maybe 48 hours before something critical fails. The bearings are undersized, the seals are improvised, and that coupling is held together by hope and welding. I built this to work, not to last. 48 hours is 48 hours more than we had. 48 hours is enough time for the Germans to notice the water is dropping, enough time for them to realize the bridge is viable again, enough time for them to attack." Kozlov absorbed this. In solving one problem, they had created another. By making their position defensible, they had made it valuable enough to attack. The flooded battlefield had been their shield. Now it would be their arena. "Then we prepare for them," Kozlov said, "and your machine keeps running." Pavel nodded slowly. "I'll need to stay with it, monitor it constantly, make repairs as things fail." "You're a civilian conscript, Volkov. You're not supposed to be on the front line during combat. If this stops working, there won't be a front line. There'll just be water and dead men." Kozlov clasped the farmer's shoulder, feeling the exhausted muscle beneath the soaked uniform. "Then I suppose you'd better keep it working." As the sun climbed higher, burning off the mist, they heard it. The distant rumble of engines. German engines. Tanks and half-tracks, their mechanical chorus announcing that the enemy had indeed noticed the change in conditions. The Battle of Krasny Bridge was about to begin in earnest. And everything depended on a farmer's crazy machine continuing to breathe. The German assault came at noon, 3 hours after the sun had fully dried the upper ground and revealed the extent of what Pavel's pumps had accomplished. From his position behind the machine, Pavel could see the enemy armor forming up on the western ridge. At least 24 vehicles, a mechanized force that would have been unstoppable if the approaches had still been flooded. Now they were merely superior. Colonel Petrov had arrived at dawn, a grizzled officer with a face like weathered granite and eyes that calculated odds with the precision of a professional gambler. He surveyed the battlefield, the lowered water, the functional bridge, and the howling monstrosity of pumps and gears. "Sergeant Kozlov," he said, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by war's absurdities, "please explain to me why our defensive position now depends on a contraption that looks like it was assembled by a drunk blacksmith." "Because it works, sir." "For how long?" Kozlov glanced at Pavel, who was elbow-deep in the gear housing, replacing a bearing race that had begun to crack. 48 hours, maybe less. "Then well, make those hours count." Petrov pointed at the German formation. "They're probing for weaknesses. They'll test our flanks first, try to ford the river north and south of here. When that fails, and it will fail because the water's still too deep everywhere except our little oasis, they'll come straight at us." "Our artillery is back in position," Kozlov reported. "The hospital is secured on high ground. We have ammunition and clear fields of fire. And if the pumps stop, then we have approximately 30 minutes before the water returns to previous levels." Petrov nodded slowly. "So our farmer here," he gestured at Pavel, "is now the most critical person in this entire defensive position. Protect him accordingly." "And Volkov?" Pavel looked up, grease-stained and exhausted. "If you survive this, I'm recommending you for a medal. If you don't survive, I'm still recommending you for a medal. Either way, the motherland owes you a drink." "I don't drink, sir." "Then the motherland owes you whatever it is farmers drink. Milk? Do farmers drink milk?" Despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the mechanical drone of the pumps that had become the soundtrack of their survival, Pavel smiled. "Sometimes, sir, when the cows cooperate." The first German probe came from the north, two half-tracks attempting to ford the river 300 meters upstream. Soviet machine guns opened up, the tracers cutting bright lines through the midday air. The half-tracks made it 20 meters before the water deepened abruptly, the vehicle's engines flooding, crews abandoning them to swim back through the current. The second probe came from the south, with similar results. At 1300 hours, the main assault began. 6 Panzer IVs led the advance, followed by infantry in trucks and on foot. They came straight down the western approach road, the only route the pumps had made passable, a killing ground that Soviet artillery had already ranged perfectly during the days of waiting. The first shells landed among the German formation like the fists of an angry god. 2 tanks were hit immediately, brewing up with internal explosions that sent turrets spinning through the air. The others spread out, returning fire, their 75mm guns hammering the Soviet positions with methodical precision. And through it all, Pavel's machine kept running. The vibrations from nearby shell impacts threatened to shake the platform apart. Shrapnel whistled overhead, punching holes in the wooden housing and ricocheting off the metal screws. Dmitri had stayed with Pavel, along with 3 others, forming a crew dedicated solely to keeping the pumps operational. When a fragment of shell casing severed one of the drive belts, Pavel replaced it with rope and wire twisted together, a repair that would have been laughable in any normal circumstance, but which held together through sheer necessity. When a bullet pierced the fuel tank of the diesel engine, sending precious fuel spraying across the platform, they plugged the hole with wood pulp and tar while the engine continued running, the fuel pressure just barely sufficient to keep the flow going. When an artillery shell landed close enough to knock the entire platform sideways, tilting the alignment of the pumps by 5 degrees and reducing their efficiency by nearly 30%, Pavel didn't try to move the whole assembly back into position. Instead, he adjusted the angle of each screw individually, compensating for the tilt by changing their orientation relative to the water flow. It was engineering by improvisation, problem-solving at a speed that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Break, fix, adapt, continue. The methodology of a farmer who had spent decades keeping machinery alive in conditions that would have defeated any factory engineer. By 1500 hours, the German assault had stalled. They had lost 4 tanks, 2 half-tracks, and nearly a company of infantry to the Soviet defensive fire. The approaches remained death traps, the concentrated firepower too much for any force to push through without overwhelming numbers. But the Soviet position was deteriorating too. Ammunition was running low. The artillery pieces, firing constantly for 3 hours, were overheating. And Pavel's machine, the linchpin of the entire defense, was beginning to fail in ways that couldn't be fixed with rope and tar. "The main axle is cracking," Pavel told Kozlov, showing him a spiderweb of fractures in the steel. "The stress load is too high. It was never designed for this kind of sustained operation." "How long do we have?" "Hours, maybe less if we're unlucky." "Can you reinforce it?" "With what? We've used everything. There's no more material." Kozlov looked around the battlefield, at the destroyed vehicles, at the defensive positions, at the very bridge they were defending. His eyes settled on the bridge's support structure, steel I-beams, solid and strong. "If we lose this position," Kozlov said slowly, "the bridge becomes worthless anyway. Better to cannibalize it now and hold the line." Pavel followed his gaze and understood immediately. You want to cut support beams out of the bridge to reinforce the pump axle. The bridge has redundant supports. It might stay standing. Might. It's either that or watch the axle fail and lose everything when the water returns. Pavel considered this for perhaps 5 seconds. Well, need cutting torches, and a way to lift the beam into position while the machine is still running. I'll get you what you need. What followed was perhaps the most audacious field repair in the history of modern warfare. While the battle continued to rage around them, while German snipers took shots at anything that moved and Soviet machine guns answered with withering fire, Pavel and his crew cut a 3-meter section of steel I-beam from the bridge's northern support structure. The bridge sagged slightly, but held. They rigged a pulley system using cable from a destroyed crane, lifting the I-beam while the diesel engine continued to run and the pumps continued to turn. Pavel positioned it parallel to the cracking axle, then began welding. Not a proper weld, not with the equipment and time they had, but a series of spot welds and mechanical clamps that would distribute the load across both pieces of steel. He worked with enemy fire snapping overhead, with the heat of the welding torch mixing with the heat of battle, with the absolute knowledge that if the axle failed before he finished, everything they'd fought for would be lost. At 16:30 hours, he completed the final weld. The reinforced axle held. The pumps continued their relentless work, the mechanical heartbeat that kept the battlefield drained and defensible. And in that moment, covered in mud and grease and rain that had started falling again, Pavel Volkov allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this. The Germans attacked again at dawn, and this time they had learned from their failures. Instead of sending armor down the obvious approach, they brought up artillery, heavy guns that had been moved into position during the night, now zeroed in on the Soviet defensive positions. The barrage began at 600 hours and continued without pause for 40 minutes. The world became nothing but noise and fire, shell bursts that walked across the Soviet lines with methodical precision. Men died in their foxholes. The hospital tents, despite being marked with red crosses, took hits that killed wounded soldiers and medics alike. The ammunition depot, already depleted, took a direct hit that sent sympathetic detonations rippling through what remained of their stores. And 50 meters from the bridge, Pavel's pump station took 3 near-simultaneous hits. The first shell destroyed one of the 6 pump screws entirely, sending twisted metal and shattered wood in all directions. The second shell killed 2 of Pavel's crew, Dmitry and a young private named Alexei, instantly, their bodies simply there one moment and gone the next. The third shell struck the diesel engine, not directly, but close enough that shrapnel tore through the housing and severed the fuel line completely. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The sudden silence was more shocking than the explosion had been. For 3 days, the mechanical roar of the pumps had been constant, a sound so omnipresent that it had become almost invisible. Now, in its absence, the battlefield seemed eerily quiet despite the continuing artillery fire. Pavel staggered to his feet, ears ringing, bleeding from a dozen small cuts where shrapnel had found flesh. He assessed the damage with the cold efficiency of a surgeon examining a patient. 5 pumps instead of 6, still viable if he could get the engine running. The engine itself was intact, but the fuel system was destroyed, fixable if he had time and materials. Dmitry and Alexei were dead. Nothing would fix that. And the water, freed from the pump's constant pressure, was already beginning to return. Kozlov appeared through the smoke, his uniform torn and his left arm hanging useless, broken by a shell fragment. Status: the machine is down. I need 30 minutes to bypass the fuel system and restart the engine. We don't have 30 minutes. The water will be back over the bridge in 20. Then I need to work faster. Volkov: with respect, Sergeant, I don't have time to explain why I can't do this faster. I just have time to do it. So, unless you're here to help, please get out of my way. Kozlov stared at him for a moment, then nodded. What do you need? Fuel line. Any vehicle fuel line. And a hand pump. Kozlov turned and ran toward the motor pool. Pavel went to work. The arterial fuel line was completely severed, multiple breaks along its length that couldn't be repaired. But the fuel tank itself was intact, and so was the engine's fuel pump. He just needed to create a new path between them. He crawled under a destroyed supply truck, ignoring the continued artillery fire, and cut free its fuel line, a rubber hose perhaps 3 meters long. He stripped the connectors, fashioned new fittings from the parts of the destroyed pump screw, and ran the new line from the diesel engine's tank to its intake manifold. The fuel pump Kozlov brought him was a hand-operated pump from a well, the kind farmers use to move water from cisterns. Pavel connected it in line with the fuel system, creating a manual primer that would let them pump fuel directly into the engine. "This won't last," Pavel said, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency despite the shaking that came from exhaustion and adrenaline. "The hand pump will fail under the pressure. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, but it'll get the engine started. Then we'll deal with the next failure when it comes," Kozlov said. "That seems to be our strategy now." Pavel looked at him, and something passed between them. The recognition that they had moved beyond conventional warfare into a realm where survival was measured in minutes and success was defined as simply still being alive when the next problem arrived. "On my mark," Pavel said, positioning himself at the engine starter cord, "pump the fuel line 3 times, then stop." Kozlov gripped the hand pump with his good arm. "Mark." Kozlov pumped, once, twice, 3 times. Fuel flowed through the new line. Pavel pulled the starter cord. The engine turned over, sputtered, caught for a moment, died. Again. Pull, sputter, catch, hold. The beautiful, terrible sound of combustion resumed, and the remaining 5 pump screws began to turn. Water that had been creeping back toward the bridge hesitated, then began to flow away again. They had bought themselves time. But as Pavel stood there, covered in fuel and blood and mud, watching the machine that had become an extension of his own will continue its work, he knew with absolute certainty that this couldn't continue. They had made too many repairs, taken too much damage, pushed too far beyond any reasonable engineering limits. The machine was dying, and when it died, so would they. Unless... An idea began to form in Pavel's mind, born from desperation and a lifetime of making impossible things work. He looked at the battlefield, at the flooded ground beyond their little island of dryness, at the German positions where enemy armor waited for the water to rise enough to make their position untenable. "Sergeant," Pavel said slowly, "I need to speak with Colonel Petrov. He's coordinating the defense. Now, this can't wait." Something in Pavel's voice, some quality of absolute conviction, made Kozlov nod. "I'll bring him to you." 15 minutes later, Colonel Petrov stood beside the howling pump machinery, listening to a mud-covered farmer explaining an idea that would either save them all or prove he had finally lost his mind. "You want to do what?" Petrov asked when Pavel had finished. "Reverse the pumps?" Pavel repeated. "Right now, we're pumping water away from our positions, but the machine can run in reverse." "We can pump water toward the German positions instead." "That's insane." "Yes, sir. The water we pump toward them will just flow back toward the river, toward us. Not if we dig channels that direct it specifically at their assembly areas. The ground slopes slightly toward their positions. If we can create fast-moving streams, targeted flows, we can turn sections of their staging area into quagmires. Not everywhere, we don't have the capacity for that, but in key areas. Their tanks need solid ground to maneuver. Take that away, and they can't advance effectively." Petrov stared at the farmer, then at the machine, then back at the farmer. How long would this take? 2 hours to reverse the pump configuration and dig the channels. Then we'd need to maintain it for perhaps 6 hours to saturate their ground enough to make it impossible. And during those 8 hours, our own positions would be flooding again? Yes, sir. We'd be giving up our defensive advantage to create an offensive disadvantage for them. That's not a strategy, that's suicide. Pavel met his eyes. "Sir, this machine is failing. I've patched it and repaired it and held it together with wire and hope. But it's going to fail completely soon. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. When it does, the water returns and we lose everything. This way, we choose when and how to use the flooding. We control it instead of being controlled by it. Sokolov, who had been listening from nearby, stepped forward. This is madness. We'd be deliberately weakening our own position. We'd be weaponizing the terrain, Pavel corrected, using the river as a weapon instead of letting it be an obstacle. A long silence followed, broken only by the mechanical breathing of the pumps and the distant crack of rifle fire. Petrov looked at the battlefield, at his exhausted men, at the German positions where fresh troops and armor continued to arrive. They were being surrounded. Slowly, methodically, the enemy was bringing up sufficient force to overwhelm them through sheer numbers. The defensive advantages created by Pavel's pumps had bought them time, but time was running out. "If this fails," Petrov said quietly, "we all die." "If we do nothing," Pavel replied, "we all die anyway. This way, at least, we die trying." Petrov smiled, a grim expression without humor. "You should have been an officer, Volkov. You think like one, which is to say, you're willing to sacrifice everything on a desperate gamble. I'm a farmer, sir. We gamble with every seed we plant and every season we endure. This is just another season." "Very well." Petrov raised his voice, calling out to the nearby soldiers. "I need every able-bodied man who can hold a shovel. We're going to dig channels, and we're going to flood the Germans before they can flood us." And so began the most audacious hydraulic warfare operation of the entire Eastern Front. Reversing the pumps required Pavel to essentially rebuild the transmission system. Gears had to be repositioned, drive belts moved to different wheels, the entire mechanical flow reversed, so that water would be drawn from the relatively clear area around the bridge and pushed outward toward the German positions. He worked with 4 men, all that could be spared from the defensive preparations, while the rest of Petrov's force dug channels. Not the careful engineered channels they'd built before, but crude trenches, barely a meter deep and 2 meters wide, carved through the muddy earth in long lines that extended from the pump station toward specific points in the German deployment. They dug toward the low ground where German armor was concentrated, toward the soft earth that would become impassable soup with sufficient water, toward every natural depression and weak point in the enemy's terrain. It took 3 hours instead of 2. The fuel pump failed after 40 minutes, and Pavel had to replace it with a second pump scavenged from another vehicle. One of the remaining pump screws developed a crack in its housing, leaking half its flow. But Pavel couldn't take the time to fix it properly. He simply wrapped it in canvas and wire and let it leak. At 1400 hours, they were ready. Pavel engaged the reversed transmission, and the pumps began drawing water from their own positions and pushing it outward. The effect was immediate and unnatural. Water that had been flowing away from them, kept at bay by constant mechanical effort, suddenly reversed course. The ground around the bridge began to soften and pool. The hospital tents had to be moved again to even higher ground. Ammunition crates were stacked on pallets to keep them above the returning water. But toward the German positions, rivers began to flow. The channeled water moved with surprising speed, following the paths they dug, spilling out across the western approaches in growing pools and streams. The Germans, who had been preparing for another assault, suddenly found their assembly areas turning into shallow lakes. A Panzer IV attempted to move forward and sank to its treads in mud that hadn't been there an hour before. A half-track tried to extract it and became stuck itself. Infantry positions became islands, men standing in ankle-deep water with nowhere to retreat to. From the Soviet positions, they watched through binoculars as the enemy's organization dissolved into chaos. "It's working," Kozlov said, something like awe in his voice. "It's actually working." "For now," Pavel replied. He was watching the machine, listening to its mechanical voice with the attention of a doctor monitoring a critical patient. "But we're running the pumps beyond any reasonable limit. The bearings are failing. The axle reinforcement is holding, but barely. And the fuel situation is getting desperate. We're consuming fuel faster than we can bring it up from the reserves." "How long can you keep this running?" 6 hours was the estimate. We're 2 hours in, so 4 more hours, maybe less. Will it be enough? Pavel looked at the flooded German positions, at the chaos they'd created, at the enemy's inability to mount a coordinated assault through terrain that had become their enemy. "I don't know, but it's all we have." The German response came an hour later, not with infantry or armor, but with their own engineering solution. They began building corduroy roads, logs laid perpendicular across the mud, creating stable surfaces for vehicles to cross. It was slower than a direct assault, but methodical and effective. Petrov ordered his artillery to concentrate fire on the road-building crews. For every log road the Germans laid down, Soviet shells tore it apart. But the Germans kept building, kept advancing meter by meter, and their own artillery hammered the Soviet positions in return. It became a race between construction and destruction, between the German engineering effort and the Soviet defensive fire, all while Pavel's machine screamed and shook and continued its impossible work. At 1700 hours, one of the remaining pump screws seized completely, its bearings welded together by heat and friction. Pavel shut it down before it could damage the rest of the system, reducing their output by another 20%. The water being pushed toward the German positions slowed, and the pools began to drain slightly as the natural flow of the river reasserted itself. At 1800 hours, the reinforced axle developed a new crack, this one bypassing Pavel's earlier repair. Metal fatigue, stress fractures propagating through the steel at microscopic speed, the inevitable result of pushing machinery beyond its design limits. At 1830 hours, the diesel engine began to overheat, its cooling system clogged with mud and debris, temperature climbing toward the point where metal would begin to warp and seals would fail catastrophically. Pavel fought each problem with the desperation of a man trying to hold back time itself. He opened the engine hood to increase airflow, accepting the risk of shrapnel damage in exchange for cooling. He reduced the pump speed slightly, trading output for reduced mechanical stress. He personally greased each remaining bearing by hand, squirming into cramped spaces to reach them while the machine continued to run around him. It was no longer engineering, it was communion with a dying mechanical god, a farmer's prayer to the spirit of broken things still somehow functioning. And then, at 1900 hours, with the sun beginning to set, they heard it. A different kind of engine sound, higher pitched, multiple sources, coming from the south. Kozlov scrambled up to the observation post and trained his binoculars toward the sound. "Reinforcements!" he shouted. "Soviet reinforcements! A full mechanized column, at least battalion strength!" The radio, which had been mostly silent due to damage, suddenly crackled to life. "Krasny Bridge Garrison, this is Major Volkonsky, 3rd Guards Mechanized Brigade. We've been ordered to relieve your position. What is your status?" Petrov grabbed the radio handset with shaking hands. "Major, this is Colonel Petrov.
Status is desperate but holding. We have flooded the western approaches to deny them to the enemy. Request immediate support to exploit this advantage. Understood, Colonel. We're moving to engage the German positions from the south. Hold for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Pavel looked at his machine, at the cracks and leaks and jury-rigged repairs that were holding it together through sheer stubbornness. 20 minutes seemed like an eternity. 20 minutes seemed impossible.
But if a farmer from Voronezh could turn a destroyed battlefield into a controllable flood zone using nothing but scrap metal and determination, then 20 minutes was just 20 minutes. Kozlov, Pavel said quietly, if this machine dies in the next 20 minutes, I need you to know that it's been the greatest honor of my life to serve beside you. It's not going to die, Volkov. You won't let it. I'm not sure I have a choice anymore. You've been making choices this entire time, choices that kept us alive when we should have died. One more choice, farmer. Make it last 20 minutes. Pavel nodded, turned back to the machine, and made his choice. He opened the fuel throttle fully, increasing the engine speed beyond safe limits. The pump spun faster, moving more water, creating stronger currents in the channels that led toward the German positions. The whole platform began to vibrate alarmingly, the reinforced axle flexing under stress that would have broken any normal shaft. 15 minutes. A bearing in the main gear train began to smoke, the grease burning away, metal grinding on metal. Pavel ignored it. There was no fixing it now. Either it held or it didn't. 10 minutes. The cracked axle began to leak metal dust, the fracture propagating faster, steel fatigue reaching its critical threshold. Pavel could hear it, a high-pitched singing sound as the metal began to tear itself apart at the molecular level. 5 minutes. The 3rd Guards Mechanized Brigade hit the German southern flank like a hammer. Fresh tanks, undamaged artillery, infantry that hadn't been fighting for a week in hell. The Germans, already disorganized by the flooded ground and the constant artillery harassment, broke under the assault. 3 minutes. The axle was going to fail. Pavel could feel it through the platform, a wrongness in the vibration pattern that spoke of imminent catastrophic failure. The machine had been pushed beyond any reasonable limit, had survived through luck and desperation, and was now reaching the end of its possible endurance. 1 minute. Pavel stood beside his creation, one hand on the vibrating metal, and silently thanked it for holding together long enough, for being exactly what they needed it to be, even if only for a few impossible days. The German positions collapsed. Enemy forces began a full retreat, abandoning equipment, splashing through the flooded ground they'd been trying to cross, fleeing from the combined pressure of Soviet defenders who had somehow held and reinforcements who had arrived at precisely the moment when all seemed lost. 30 seconds. Pavel reached for the engine shut off. And then, with a sound like a rifle shot, the reinforced axle snapped. The main gear train, suddenly released from rotational force, spun freely for one revolution before the whole transmission assembly tore itself apart. Gears stripped, drive belts snapped, pump screws ground to a halt with the screech of tortured metal. The diesel engine, no longer under load, over-revved wildly until Pavel hit the kill switch, dropping the battlefield into sudden silence. The machine was dead, but the battle was won. Pavel stood there in the growing darkness, listening to the sound of victory. Soviet troops cheering, German engines retreating, the crack of rifle fire fading into the distance. He looked at the broken machinery that had been their salvation, at the twisted metal and cracked gears and every impossible repair that had held together just enough. Kozlov appeared beside him, his wounded arm in a crude sling, his face showing exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "It lasted 21 minutes," Kozlov said.
Close enough, Pavel replied.
They stood there together, farmer and soldier, watching the sun set over a battlefield that they'd controlled not with superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but with hydraulic engineering and the stubborn refusal to accept failure. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with reports of enemy casualties, of captured equipment, of strategic advantage gained. The Battle of Krasny Bridge would be recorded in official histories as a successful defensive action, a minor but significant victory in the larger campaign. But Pavel Volkov, standing beside the corpse of his impossible machine, knew the truth. They hadn't won because of military doctrine or strategic planning. They had won because a farmer had looked at a problem, gathered whatever broken pieces were available, and built something that worked just enough to matter. It was, in its own way, exactly like farming. You plant seeds in uncertain soil. You fight against nature and time and the inevitable entropy of all things. And sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and lucky enough and refuse to quit even when logic says you should, you get a harvest. This had been his harvest, strange and terrible and beautiful. And as the last light faded from the sky, Pavel allowed himself to finally rest. The official report would be filed 3 weeks later, after the front had moved west and Krasny Bridge had become just another strategic point on maps that officers studied in warm headquarters. The report would praise the defensive actions of Colonel Petrov's battalion, would note the timely arrival of the 3rd Guards Mechanized Brigade, would mention in passing that local engineering efforts contributed to the successful defense. But that was the official history. The real history was being written in quieter ways, by men who had been there. Sergeant Kozlov, his arm in a proper cast now, wrote letters to the families of Dmitry and Alexei, telling them their sons had died keeping a machine running that had saved hundreds of lives. He didn't mention that the machine had been a farmer's mad dream. He didn't need to. The families would understand that their boys had died doing something important, and that was enough. Lieutenant Sokolov, the skeptical quartermaster who had doubted every moment of Pavel's work, requisitioned enough steel, fuel, and machinery to build a proper pump station at Krasny Bridge. For future defensive requirements, he wrote in the official request. But everyone knew it was because he'd seen what was possible when desperation met determination, and he wanted to be ready if it ever needed to happen again. Colonel Petrov did indeed recommend Pavel for a medal, the Order of the Red Star, for exceptional technical achievement under combat conditions. The medal arrived 6 months later, delivered to Pavel's farm in Voronezh by a young lieutenant who had been instructed to present it with full ceremony. Pavel accepted it politely, placed it in a drawer with his other farm documents, and went back to repairing an irrigation pump that had broken down during the winter. The war would continue for 3 more years. The front would move west, then collapse back, then push forward again in the grinding attrition that characterized the Eastern Front. Men would die in numbers that defied comprehension, their names forgotten, their sacrifices recorded only as statistics. But at Krasny Bridge, where the Volkhov River continued its eternal flow, there stood a monument that had never been officially commissioned. The soldiers who remained there after the battle had built it themselves. A framework of metal and gears salvaged from Pavel's destroyed pump station, mounted on a concrete base. It didn't work. It wasn't meant to. It was art, or memory, or tribute. The best way simple soldiers knew to mark something important that had happened here. At the base of the monument, someone had welded a steel plate with words hammered into the metal by hand. Here, a farmer made water flow uphill. Here, impossible became possible. Here, we held. Pavel never saw the monument. He never returned to Krasny Bridge after the battle, never felt the need to revisit the place where he'd performed his strange miracle.
For him, it had been just another problem that needed solving, another crisis where broken things needed to work just long enough. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the irrigation pumps were running smoothly and the fields were green with new growth, he would think about those days. About the sound of 6 enormous screws turning, lifting water that wanted to fall. About the faces of men who had trusted him when they had no reason to except desperation. About the moment when a farmer's knowledge and a soldier's courage had combined to change the shape of a battle. The war would end eventually. The Soviet Union would claim victory. History books would be written, naming the great battles and the famous generals. Krasny Bridge would merit perhaps a footnote, if that. But on his farm in Voronezh, Pavel Volkov continued the work he'd always done, planting seeds, mending fences, keeping machinery running past any reasonable expectation of its endurance. It was honest work. It was important work. And sometimes, when the irrigation pumps were running at full capacity, moving water across his fields in defiance of gravity and common sense, he would pause to listen to their mechanical chorus and remember. Remember that once, for a few impossible days, a farmer's pump had held back not just water, but the tide of war itself. And for those few days, that had been enough.
The last irrigation pump on the Volkov farm failed on a spring morning in 1956, 11 years after the war ended. Pavel was 73 years old, still working his fields, still solving problems with wire and determination. He stood beside the broken pump, assessing the damage with eyes that had dimmed but still saw clearly enough. The shaft was cracked. The bearings were worn smooth. The housing had rusted through in 3 places. His son, Mikhail, who had survived the war by luck and had returned to help run the farm. Can you fix it? Pavel looked at the pump, at his own weathered hands, at the fields that needed water. He thought about Krasny Bridge, about a different pump that had been held together by impossible repairs and stubborn faith. He thought about how long you could push machinery past its limits before nature simply said, enough. No, Pavel said quietly. This one's finished. Time to build something new. With what? We can't afford new equipment. Pavel smiled, the expression familiar to anyone who'd ever worked beside him when the world was ending and the impossible needed doing. Well, use what we have. We always do. And so, on a spring morning in 1956, a farmer in Voronezh began gathering pieces of broken machinery, planning how to make them work together, preparing to build something that shouldn't be possible, but would function anyway. Because that was what farmers did. That was what survivors did. That was what humans did, when the alternative was giving up. And Pavel Volkov had never learned how to quit. The fields needed water. The pump would run. Somehow, it always did.